Thank you, Jenny, for that introduction. And I wanted to begin by addressing your question of who owns the Pacific. And as a native person from the island of Guahan, or Guam, as it's more popularly known to the world, we as Indigenous peoples clearly have rights to the lands, territory, and resources, as is outlined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so I wanted to start by sharing this map here of our region. And as you can see, my island here of Guahan is sort of this central connecting point in terms of the strategic geopolitical dynamics in the Asia Pacific region. And so our island has been noted to be the center stage of many different military triangles with the United States, spanning and connecting the East with the West, particularly looking at connections to Alaska and San Diego, clearly part of the Pacific Command in Hawaii, as well as into the various bases in with South Korea, as well as throughout Japan and all the way down to Australia. And so as you can see from this slide, clearly our positionality in the Pacific makes us it proves to be very problematic in terms of the exploitation and use of our lands. So our island is an unincorporated territory of the United States. We've been so since the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898. And we remain on the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories and have been. We're one of the remaining 17 remnants globally of the colonial period. And so we've been on the list since its inception. And you can see how negotiating our freedom and any kind of political development is very much very difficult with its challenges, because the US, of course, with us as a territory, has what it refers to as quote unquote maximum flexibility, meaning essentially that they can do whatever they wish without any consultation, not even with our elected leadership. And so our island is very, very tiny in the Pacific. We're about 212 square miles. My apologies if you're a metric system person. And our population base is just over 170,000 people. But what is notable on such a small, tiny place is the fact that the DoD's footprint, Department of Defense, US Department of Defense, footprint on our island is roughly 1/3, or between 29 and 31% of the island. And so the Department of Defense actually is the largest single landowner of the island. And in contrast, our local government of Guam only controls 19% of our land. And so this has been the case primarily since the end of World War II. With the recent announcement, and this is where we connect to the movement in Okinawa, in 2006, there was an announcement that they would be transferring roughly 8,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guahan, which of course would have resulted in an increase and is already an active plan that's in place in terms of the increased militarization of the island. And had their plans come to fruition as anticipated, they would control up to 42% of our island. And so what has militarization meant for us in the Pacific? And so it's meant a number of different things. And in this slide, I wanted primarily to convey an environment that is highly hyper-militarized. You know, when we talk about the Cold War and we talk about the thawing of the Cold War, the possible, engaging the Cold War, in so many ways, war has never thawed for us in the Pacific, particularly in my island. As you can see in these images here, our region, and when I say our region, I'm specifically referring to Micronesia, which is the region within the Pacific that Guahan is located. We've been complicit to, as is in this photo here, human radiation experiments, particularly with the nuclear testing that has happened in the Marshall Islands. We have hyper-militarization of our youth, largely being, as a territory, one of the highest areas of enlistment in US Department of Defense, largely due to economic constraints of the development of our economy, and consequentially the elevation of US military enlistment as part of the economic conscripts in a territory. You also see, ironically enough, hyper American allegiance. And you see this because of the fact that in this case, we were an active war zone. And so hence you see invasion as well as the remnants of war that continue today. And so when we look at the legacy of what it's meant, the US's footprint in Micronesia on Guahan, you see land dispossession, obviously taken for the purposes of base development. We see the radiation exposure that stems from the Marshall Islands. And what's not often spoken of is those who are within downwind of destination sites. And in the case of our island, we are within direct downwind of the Marshall Islands. And so our level of exposure to radiation, we have data that suggests that it is close to rivaling the numbers in the Marshall Islands in terms of strontium-90 levels and other radioactive isotopes. Clearly, when you have bases, you have high levels of environmental devastation, toxic contamination, not only from military training exercises and war preparation, but also from active war zones, right? And so we see this as very problematic, particularly when you look at current health outcomes of our people. There's the desecration of ancestral remains for the development of bases. This is just today, as a matter of fact, we had a protest looking at the development of lands for the purposes of this new military buildup and its impact that it's had in terms of disturbing ancestral remains from their natural placement. We have poor health outcomes, particularly looking at cancer rates. We have high rates of death from war because of the high rates of enlistment. And of course, the experience of war occupation, particularly in World War II. We had sex slavery with comfort women, although we're not known for this. This certainly occurred on our island during the World War II period, work encampments, torture, and massacres during this time frame. In addition, there's the prohibition of traditional practices, such as access to fishing grounds, which is a traditional practice, as well as access to medicines that are used in our traditional systems to heal our bodies. As part of this presence as well is our complicity to war and destruction. So Guam is most known for our involvement, if you will, in terms of World War II, but even more recently in terms of the DPRK threats to the island. And of course, we as Native peoples of the island have absolutely nothing to do with why we're being threatened. However, the US's presence clearly compromises our safety. And so part of what ends up happening is our complicity to war. So within our region as well, in the Mariana Island chain, we have the island of Tinian to the north of our island, which is the place from which the bombs that were sent to Hiroshima and to Nagasaki were detonated or were sent. And so this complicity to war and destruction is something that obviously we're not comfortable with and that needs to be, we're pretty much held at the discretion of the United States. And so for us on the ground, we vision peace, and we really, this little girl here, her name is Guanaiza, her name in our language means love, and really we're very motivated by considering future generations and reclaiming the Pacific for ourselves. Thank you.